Good day, everyone. Today is Monday, June 10th, 2019, and we're at the beginning of our webinar, Designing for Accessibility with POUR. I'm your host, Mike Lasecki. I'll be working in the background to make sure that all of the systems are performing well. All of our audio checks have done well. This is a live event and it's being recorded. You'll automatically get a link to the recording. Thank you for joining again today. Now I'm going to advance the slide, and it's my pleasure to introduce our presentation team. Starting on the left, Rachel Bauer is the Director and Principal Investigator of the project known as AccessATE. She serves a dual role as PI of ATE Central, and she's located at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Rachel, thank you for joining today. Please say hello to everyone and tell us more about the webinar and introduce your co-presenter.
Hi, Mike. Well, we're just thrilled to be here. I think this is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to be able to share good information with everybody in the community, the AT community and beyond. As Mike said, I direct and co-direct AccessATE and AT Central, and we're based at a research center called Internet Scout Research Group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm going to talk to you in just a few minutes a little bit more about ATE and AccessATE, but first I want to let Luis introduce himself briefly, and then I know he's going to be taking over and doing the bulk of the work today on our webinar. So Luis, you want to just say a few words about your own background?
Sure. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to be with you today. I'm currently a technical assistant specialist at the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. We go by the AEM Center for short, and we're based at CAST. And we'll mention a little bit about CAST in just a few minutes. My background is I have about 20 years of experience in technology, and about 15 of those have been in the field of assistive technology and digital accessibility support. And I'm also a person with a disability myself. So I have low vision, and so I approach my work from both a professional and personal perspective. So we're so glad that you're joining us here today. I'm really excited to share with you information about accessibility.
Thank you so much, Luis. And if you notice, folks, for the first time, we actually have live captioning running on our webinar. You can see that probably in the center of the screen there. And that's captioning is being provided to us by the Media Access Group at WGBH Boston. So we're thrilled to have a more accessible webinar for everyone today as we move forward. All right. So we've told you a little bit about ourselves, and one of the things that we're going to do throughout the webinar today is ask polls and ask you to be as interactive as possible. Obviously, we wish everybody could talk and interact, but with this many of us on, it would be very difficult. So Mike's going to open this first poll. We just kind of know why you're joining us, what your reason is for joining us today. And you're all clicking buttons and telling us about that. If you do put an other, please, as we said, please share your answer in the chat window. Okay. Okay, so a lot of people, our largest area, Luis, sort of not surprising, I lead others who develop content and want to provide my team with tips and resources on accessibility. So that's great. And we got a couple of others. Somebody said they're an evaluator for ATE. I teach OT and want to provide current info. Holly said she's a librarian developing e-learning materials and digital literacy skills for students.
That's great.
I'm the school's accessibility authority for now, and the more I can support them, the better. That's great. All right, so a lot of people are typing in good information, exactly the kinds of things we want to hear from you guys in these polls. All right, Mike, thank you so much for doing that. I think we can shift that. Okay, so let me just tell folks, we probably have a mixed group. Some of you are involved with ATE and many of you may not be. These invites go out to a large group of folks, but just to remind everybody, if you're not familiar, ATE stands for Advanced Technological Education. It's actually a National Science Foundation funding stream. So it provides funding to primarily to community colleges. In fact, it's NSF's only program that is primarily focused on funding community college program development, program improvement, professional development. About 300 to 320 projects and centers are funded nationally across the U.S. And it, beyond being a funding program, which of course is a lovely thing and very important to all of us, it's really a true community with a lot of cross-cutting support for the members baked into the program. And one of those projects, our Internet Scout is actually involved with a couple of these sorts of projects, but the one we're focusing on today is AccessATE, which really looks at providing support from a number of content specialists and content partners like Louise at the AEM Center to help people understand more about how to make the work they're doing accessible to a wider variety of students and faculty. So both increasing awareness and then providing guidance about tools and the kinds of support that's out there to make those changes. The partners are CAST, obviously, Louise, the AEM Center and CAST, HURL, which is at Pitt, which focuses on wheelchair accessibility and veteran issues related to veteran disability and accessibility. The National Center for Accessible Media, which is based at WGBH, and DefTech, which is an ATE-funded center at RIT. So we have this wonderful group of content specialists who are bringing together to do live events like this webinar and in-person events at conferences. So we have lots of different project activities and goals that we're going to be doing throughout each year, the 4 years of the project. So I'm going to turn it over to Luis now to talk about AIM.
All right, so the National AEM Center at CAST, our goal is really to increase the availability and use of high quality accessible materials and technologies. And the ultimate goal is to improve learning opportunities and outcomes for learners with disabilities. And so both of those sides of the equation are important. I'm going to discuss that in more detail a little bit later. But thinking about both making sure that the materials that are being created and developed are accessible, and then that there's awareness out there and a demand for accessible materials. Both are important to us. And we work with a number of stakeholders. We work with publishers and developers on the availability side. We work with states and districts, post-secondary institutions, workforce development agencies, and then a very important constituency that's not on this slide. We also work with families to make sure that they understand what's available in terms of accessibility and accessible educational materials. And so we're really happy to partner with AccessATE, and we welcome this opportunity to be part of this webinar and share some information about accessibility. Now, the AIM Center is, as I said in my introduction, is based at CAST. And CAST is an organization that has a mission, which is to bust the barriers to learning that millions of people experience every day. And we do this by helping educators apply some insights from the learning sciences and some leading edge practices from the classroom and apply those insights that we've gained over a couple of decades now of research to the design of educational environments. And so you're probably most familiar with CAS. If you are familiar with the Universal Design for Learning principles, CAS is the organization where those principles were developed starting in the early 1980s. All
We
right,
have a
so
second.
we would like.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry about that. I was on mute, Luis. No worries. One thing, can you remind me can you remind everybody what CAS stands for? Tim was just asking what the acronym is, and I can never remember myself. Oops. All right, so I think Luis is on mute at the moment, but let's go ahead and take a second poll. So what is your current role? You guys are already doing it because you're on top of it here. And again, if you can put your other in chat. We've got some other folks, instructional technologist at a community college. Again, another librarian, an e-learning librarian. Somebody said none of the above. Grants coordinator, that's exciting to have someone from that world. Director of faculty development. Okay, so we have a nice mix of folks today attending. And a good portion of you guys are not from ATE. So we have about a quarter of folks are from the ATE world. All right, that's great. Let's move along to our next slide here. All right, Luis, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Rachel, I'm not hearing Luis's audio for a moment.
I'm not hearing Luis. I'm not. We have it is a live event, folks. So sometimes these things happen. Luis, are you still with us? I wonder if you can chat to us.
Yeah, we'll just pause for a moment and set this up.
Pause for a second. Make sure that at least it's not a fire alarm. Those of you who have joined us before may recall a very amusing situation.
Looks like Luis has gone out. He'll be back in a second. He'll probably relogging back in. So let's give him just a moment. Thanks. Thank you, folks, for your patience.
Bear with us. So I'm going to start by asking everybody, because I know Luis was going to do this, so I can go ahead and kickstart this. I'd like to hear from you all. I'm going to advance the slide here really quickly. So what does accessibility mean to you? What, if you were going to think about the word accessibility, please let us hear some of your answers in terms of what you think accessibility means. Let's get that going in the chat window. All right, we've got good for one is good for all, access to all. Ooh, that's a very good answer. Accessibility is inclusivity. Everyone is able to use or experience. Let's see here. Enablement, inclusivity, create an environment in which all can participate. Opportunity. All students have access to the same content, good user experience for all parties.
Rachel, while people are typing in, let's pause for a moment and see if we've reconnected with Luis. Luis, are you on with audio?
I am connected. Sorry about that.
Okay, good.
No worries.
Welcome back. Thank you. Go ahead.
Luis, I went ahead and got people going in the chat window with what does accessibility mean to you? So we've got lots of really great answers coming up. Can you see all of that? I'm sort of scrolling back here so we can see.
Absolutely. I see some of those great answers that came in. Sorry about that slight glitch there. As you know, with technology, sometimes you're going along nice and smooth and then something just pops up.
Yes.
But the important thing is to think on your toes. So if anything happens, I will just reconnect. We're having some here in Florida. So, but I see Robin, the last answer that I see here is really an important one. And she talks about equity. And what an important concept to keep in mind. So it's about equitable opportunities. So great. Thank you, everybody, for your input, your feedback. That's exactly what we want to see, is for you to share in the chat all your great insights. So I want to share with you one definition of accessibility, and this is one that we share quite a bit from the National AEM Center. And from our perspective, and this is actually something that comes out of the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. And this definition basically is that accessibility is when a person with a disability can do three things. They can acquire the same information, they can engage in the same interactions, and they can enjoy the same services as a person without a disability. And then there's some qualifiers. And the qualifiers are that the person with a disability has to be able to enjoy that access in an equally effective, equally integrated manner, and with substantially equivalent ease of use. And by substantially equivalent ease of use, we mean that it's at the same time as individuals without a disability. So it's not a week later, it's not a month later, it's at the same time, or as in a timely fashion as possible. Because as you know, if a student doesn't have timely access to their materials and the information that they need for learning, then there is a danger that they will fall behind. And so again, we want to make sure that we keep that equity question in the back of our minds. So thank you for Robin for sharing that in the chat. As I mentioned at the beginning, since the AEM Center is part of CAST, we keep that universal design for learning perspective in mind as well. And so accessibility is just one component of universal design for learning. And from this perspective, this is a great quote that's in the introduction to the Universal Design for Learning guidelines, which is something that CAST produced starting in the early 2000s, but then it's been revised a number of times since. And so this quote is that the purpose of education is not just to make information accessible, but rather to teach learners how to transform accessible information into usable knowledge. And so that's really important. Accessibility is foundational to universal design for learning. It's essential, but not sufficient. So a friend of mine actually uses the term that accessibility is sort of like the welcome mat for universal design for learning. It's like when you show up to a building, you want to make sure that you're able to get into the building so that you can enjoy all the wonderful activities that take place inside that building. All of the fun and games, all of the sharing that happens, all of those things that happen inside the building, you need to be able to take advantage of it. Well, the entrance has to be accessible. Everyone needs to be able to get into the building to enjoy all of that. And so the UDL guidelines, one of the layers of those guidelines focuses on accessibility, but there are others that focus on sort of the learning skills and the learning behaviors that learners need to develop in order to become what we call expert learners. That means people that are experts at learning, that they enjoy learning, they want to learn more, and they know where to access information, and again, know how to turn it into usable knowledge. Accessibility is also important as a way to basically meet some of the key principles of non-discrimination that are the foundation for our civil rights laws. And two of our important civil rights laws are the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and then Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And the two core principles behind those civil rights laws are equal treatment and equal opportunity. And so we want to make sure that everyone has, as many of you mentioned in the chat, be able to access all of the benefits in an equal way or an equitable way, all of the benefits that the technology has to offer and that the environment has to offer in an equitable way. And this is important to put it into a broader context in our society in terms of educational attainment. So we know that there have been some progress made, and it's important to pause and acknowledge that. So we see that the number of students with disabilities in higher education is increasing, and it's great to see that. But there are still some gaps that remain. And so, for example, when we look at individuals with disabilities that graduate with a bachelor's degree or higher, that still lags behind those without disabilities somewhat. So it's about half of the number of people without disabilities that graduate from college with a bachelor's degree, which is about 35%. Well, for individuals with disabilities, that's about half of that, or 16, 17%. And then, of course, we know that those gaps in education then also translate into some gaps in the workforce. And so we see from some of the latest statistics from the US Department of Labor that the workforce participation is significantly lower for people with disabilities compared to those who do not have disabilities. So it's about 1 in 5 people with disabilities participate in the workforce, as opposed to a little over 2/3 for those without disabilities. And even though we are in a pretty good employment environment where we're at or close to full employment, the unemployment rate is still twice as high for people with disabilities. So again, I want to acknowledge all the progress that we've made, but we also still have some areas where we still need to do some work in order to close those gaps and make sure that everybody has equal access, equitable access. All right, so here's another poll for you.
Yeah, so we want to know if something can be 100% accessible. What do you guys think? Right. Numbers are mounting here. Most people are in the no or not sure camp. Some in the yes now, too. All right. So it looks like most people say no or not sure, Luis.
Great, thanks for that feedback. So if we could go ahead and hide the poll. So the reason why I asked this question is because a lot of times when people are evaluating products, that's the question that you hear. Is it accessible or not? But what we know is that the question is actually a little bit more complex. And the reason for that is that we use technology in a variety of settings. And then also people vary greatly. So it's difficult to meet the needs of everyone with just one solution. Again, going back to that concept of universal design. And so instead of asking, is it accessible? Probably a better question is, to whom and under what conditions or for which tasks? So those questions take into consideration the contextual nature of accessibility. So from that perspective, it's difficult for something to be 100% accessible, right? Because again, of that variability not only in the end users, but also in the context in which materials and technologies are going to be used. However, something can be more accessible. And so that's what we're aiming for, right? So maybe we can't reach 100% accessibility, but that should be our North Star. That should be our goal. And the closer we can get to it, the better it is for our end users, the better experience they're going to have. So we can make things more accessible, is what I'm saying. And when we think about accessibility, it's important to consider both the materials and the technologies. As I mentioned at the beginning, at the AEM Center, we work on both the availability and the use. And so in a similar way, when we think about accessibility, we need to consider the materials and the technologies that go along with them. And we need to consider the interoperability between the two. So when we think about the materials, what we're talking about is really what's the information or the content that's going to be learned. And we want to make sure that that content is designed or enhanced in such a way that it is usable by the widest possible range of learners, keeping in mind that concept of learner variability. And that's the case regardless of what the format is, whether it's a document, an image, a video. We want to make sure that it's usable across a wide range of different people. And then the technologies, that's going to be the hardware or the software that delivers that content. And again, we want to make sure that it's usable by people with a wide range of abilities and disabilities. And that the technology is either directly usable without assistive technology or that it's made usable with it. And that's the definition that we've drawn from accessibletech.org if you want to check that out. But again, the concept here is that the two should work hand in hand or in harmony because you get a synergy from the two that where the sum is greater than the parts. So I want to share with you one example, and this is a personal example for me because this is something that I experience on a daily basis. I love to read. And so on the screen, what we have is a figure, human being holding a tablet. And on the tablet, they're accessing an ebook, and that ebook might be in a format like EPUB, which is what I prefer to read. So this is an example where the reader, the person who's reading the content, is accessing it on a device that has a number of accessibility options built in. So for instance, they could change how information is displayed. Most tablets, most devices nowadays have a number of settings that you can change in order to adjust the display. So you can make the text bigger, you can change the background color, the text color, you can even switch out the fonts. So if the font that's displayed is not as legible for you, you can change it out for one that is easier to read on the screen. A lot of ebooks now have embedded content, and so you could have a video or a simulation, especially for a really complex concept, something that's difficult to understand. Sometimes including a video or a simulation can make it a little bit more accessible in terms of understanding. So if we have any embedded content, we would want to have closed captions or video description as an alternative for people who are not able to either see the content or hear it. And then we could also turn on a number of accessibility features. An example of one of those is the screen reader. So just in case you're not familiar with what a screen reader is, it's software that somebody can turn on and then have whatever's displayed on the screen can be read out loud with a synthesized voice. And most screen readers provide a variety of different ways that you can navigate the content. You could either use keyboard shortcuts, or with some of the newer screen readers, you can use gestures on a touchscreen to navigate. And as you navigate using those shortcuts or gestures, then you'll hear different things that are shown on the screen read out loud to you. But maybe you can still, you still have some vision like me. Well, maybe you just need a little bit of help with text-to-speech. And a number of learners with disabilities who maybe just need some help with the decoding of the text may turn on text-to-speech so that they can read the content on the screen, but also listen to it at the same time with some highlighting that helps them track where they are in the content. And then sometimes you can also connect Bluetooth devices. So it is possible on many devices to connect a Bluetooth Braille display where the person can follow along using refreshable Braille. And so with that device, basically one line at a time, the device shows the Braille that corresponds to what the screen reader would be reading on the device. So there are a number of different tools that could be used by someone who needs alternative access to that content on a tablet. And so again, that's a great illustration of that material and technology both being in accessible harmony. On the National AEM Center website, we have a section of the site called Personalizing the Reading Experience. And so here you will learn about, as I mentioned, a number of those display options that you can change in your devices, as well as the built-in text-to-speech that's available on a number of devices now. So it covers different platforms ranging from Apple devices to Windows, to Google Chrome. So a lot of schools have gone Google, and there are a number of extensions that you can add to the Chrome web browser to read the text-to-speech or use text-to-speech to read the content out loud. And I've even included a section on smart speakers because people are starting to use those like your Amazon Echo or your Google Home smart speakers to access ebooks and so on those devices. So I encourage you to check out that section of the AEM Center website. And if you can't find it, you can always do a search. We have a very comprehensive search feature that allows you to find the content right away. So you could type in something like reading, and it will probably take you right there. All right, so for this first part of the webinar, we've really been focusing on sort of the background information, why this is important. What is it when we talk about accessibility? What do we mean? But now we're going to turn to the how of AEM. But before I do that, I want to pause here and see if there are any questions for me, Rachel, in the chat. Because I know that was me talking.
No, there have been a couple of, actually there have been a couple of questions. One of them somebody asked just sort of generally, how does accessibility get paid for? Who pays for the cost of accessibility?
That is a good question. With universal design for learning, one of the things that I like to say is that it's sort of front loaded. And so there may be some initial costs and so on, but over time, you kind of realize some of those benefits. And so that's one of the challenges is that, those upfront costs, they're more visible, if that makes sense, than the benefits that you get over time. So that is a big challenge when it comes to accessibility.
Yeah, and I would think that some of it, if you're at an educational institution, you are often doing curriculum design or redesign, and so there would certainly be a cost in starting to think about, although I don't think it's a terribly high cost, in starting to think about redesigning your curriculum with the tenets of universal design for learning. You might want to have one of your people do more reading on the AIM and CAST website. You might be able to get funding from somewhere to do some professional development for your faculty. But once you understand the tenets, I would think then your faculty is able to do more and more of it sort of baked in. The other thing that was interesting to me, Luis, is somebody actually asked about this, and I think it's a really good point. I'm not sure if we can get into answering it today, but this person was saying that they work in workforce, and that you can see Tim's question, that it's a sort of a comment that involves a combination of knowledge and physical skills. There's certainly many ways to deliver the knowledge content. It's the skills area that presents the greatest challenge. And I think what he's saying, if I'm understanding this, is things like the physical activities. So being in a setting where you're having to do, and you and I have talked about this, Luis, things like robotics, where you're in a physical setting and working with a student with a particular disability who is trying to figure out how to modify all the lab equipment, I assume that's what Tim is asking about.
Right. Yeah, and to add to what you said, Rachel, there's also the idea of being proactive as opposed to reactive. And so through proactive planning, it tends to be much better than sort of retrofitting after the fact. So if you can incorporate accessibility into your workflow, into your design process from the beginning, it's tends to be less costly than if you wait until the end and you sometimes have to start over. Or the solutions that you come up with are just not as elegant sometimes when you try to retrofit. So just keeping that in mind. And then to that question, I don't know if we're going to be able to answer in this webinar.
Yeah, it's a tricky one for sure.
The second one I'm referring to regarding the so if we have some time at the end, and we can come back to that one.
And I also think it's potentially an interesting area to look for funding from someplace like ATE. In other words, it's an interesting place to think about. I know that part of our goal with AccessATE is to provide some UDL training to some ATE projects and centers, but ATE is a granting institution. They do equipment and various other kinds of funding, so it's a possibility at least that you could do professional development. You could get money for professional development or for equipment modification from various funding, from funding like NSF. I think Cheryl is talking about how difficult it is here to that people think that that faculty just inherently know how to do this, and that if they're chemists, they don't necessarily have any background in accessibility training. So I think that's just to point out, Cheryl, it's a big part of the reason we're doing the work we're doing with AccessATE is because we feel like for faculty, this isn't necessarily in their skill set, and so we want to bring folks like Luis into the community to help provide that support. Anyway, we should probably move on, and if we get more questions, Luis, we can bring those up.
Absolutely, but thank you for bringing up these really important questions. Really appreciate that. All right, so in this next segment, I'm going to focus on the how of AIM and share with you some tips to make your documents more accessible and inclusive. And before I continue, a lot of the things I'm going to focus on here are best practices. So even though I'm going to be focusing on documents and I may look at a specific platform, like say Microsoft Office, a lot of these are best practices that apply across a number of different types of materials. So just keep that in mind as we continue here. And also, this is one of my favorite quotes. It was shared with me by one of my coworkers at CAST, Mindy Johnson. And so I want you to keep this in the back of your mind. And I think it gets to some of the issue that I think Cheryl was bringing up, is to do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. So we're always telling our students to have a growth mindset, right? So we need to sort of take some of our own medicine and have a growth mindset ourselves. And so it's just continuous improvement should be the focus, right? Continuing to get better. And you can start small. You can start with one of these practices. And then once you master that, then you can move to the next one. And eventually what we're trying to do is change habits. And that doesn't happen overnight. That takes some time to change habits and mindsets. So again, I'm just giving you permission to be kind to yourself as you learn about accessibility, and to just follow this mantra of do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. So today we're going to be looking at some guidelines for accessibility. And there's an international standard for accessibility. It's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There have been a number of versions of those guidelines put out by the W3C, which is a World Wide Web consortium. The current version is 2.1. However, it is backward compatible to 2.0. So it's essentially taking 2.0 and then reflecting some changes in technologies over the year. So it's basically an update to reflect the changing context of technology and the way that the web has changed. So one of the challenges with approaching those guidelines from the W3C is that they can be really complex and use a lot of technical knowledge. So one of the things that they've done is there are a set of 4 principles that are foundational to these guidelines. And that's what I'm going to focus on today as an entry point to WCAG, which is a short way of saying the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So WCAG or WCAG. So the 4 principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And we're going to unpack those in just a second. On the screen, we have a really nice icon for these principles that one of our designers at CAST developed. And so you can see a variety of different materials. There's a book with some braille, some images on it, and then there's a number of devices displaying the same content. A mobile phone, a monitor. There's a phone where somebody's probably listening to it using some headphones. And then there's not only a keyboard, but also a switch, which is a device for alternative access, where if you can't use the keyboard, there is a software that runs on the computer that basically moves a cursor around on the screen. And by pressing a button, you can make a choice and perform some commands on the device. So I just wanted to go over that icon with you and provide a description for it. So on the AEM Center website, again, we have an entire section on POUR, those 4 foundational concepts of WCAG. And it's called Designing for Accessibility with POUR, which is the title of today's webinar. And so there is an introductory video, kind of provides an overview, and then there's a page for each of the principles. And on each of those pages, you'll find different techniques with links to supporting videos, supporting resources, and just quick explanations. And we've tried to create them in as plain language as possible to make sure that they're useful to as wide an audience as possible as well. So I encourage you again, if you just do a search for POUR on our website, P-O-U-R, it will likely be one of the first options that shows up. So when we look at these principles, the first one, the P in POUR, is perceivable. And for each of these, I'm going to pose a question. So the question is really, what's the intent, or what's the goal that you're trying to achieve in addressing this principle? And then we're going to look at some ways that you can address that intent. So for perceivable, the question is, can everyone see and hear the content? And I would make that even broader, is Do people have options for how they access the information? Or is the information relying on a single sense? So does it require that you be able to see? Well, what happens if you can't see? Is there an alternative for you how to access that information? Does it require you to be able to hear? Well, if you can't hear, is there another option? And so that gets into the how, where we're providing alternatives. We're providing alternative text for visuals, and we provide captions and transcripts for videos or other media that could be embedded in the content. That could be a simulation, or again, it could be a video or an audio file. So placing this in the context today of a syllabus, I love to focus on the syllabus because it's one of the first things that learners will interact with in a course. And so right away you get some feedback as a learner as to what that experience in this course is going to be like. So it's really important that we address accessibility in the syllabus. Again, that's like the welcome mat to the course. And so if it's not a welcoming experience from the start, then as a student with a disability, and I've experienced this myself, I know that I'm in for a challenging experience, a challenging semester in that course. So in terms of the syllabus, we might have an opening section to the syllabus where we have an instructor photo, and then we may have the contact information. I love to add a photo to my syllabi because that can be helpful if students find you on campus. It's helpful for them to know who exactly you are in case they have questions and they can approach you on campus. But I think it also creates a really nice, it's a really nice way to add some social presence to the course, especially if you're just teaching online where that social presence sometimes can be lacking. And so one of the things we can do here is make sure that that image of the faculty member has alternative text. So there are two parts to adding a text alternative for an image. The easiest part is actually how to do it. The more difficult part is what actually makes good alternative text. So let me address those two parts in turn. So first, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be focusing on Microsoft Office, but these principles apply whether you're using Google Docs, you're using Apple Pages. Most of these authoring applications, including possibly your LMS, may have an option for adding alternative text. So in Office 365, which is what I'm using right now, the process for adding a text alternative for an image is really simple. There's a couple of ways you can do this. One is that you can right-click the image and just choose Edit All Text. And that's going to bring up a pane where you can enter your alternative text. Or, and this is really exciting, you can use artificial intelligence. So you can tap a button or click a button and say or select Generate a description for me. However, I would kind of caution you that artificial intelligence is not quite where we want it to be at this time. It's a work in progress, if you will. And so you definitely still want to make sure that you check what you come up with when you use AI or artificial intelligence to make sure that it accurately describes the image. And then the other option that you'll have, and we'll see this in just a second, is if the image is just there for decoration or for eye candy, then you can mark it as decorative. And that basically tells the screen reader, skip that image. It doesn't really add to the content. It doesn't add any meaning. And so it should be skipped. And so again, the easiest way is to just right-click the image or access it through the contextual menu. On some devices, you have to press a keyboard shortcut and then choose Edit All Text. Or there's also an option in the ribbon that appears at the top of your Microsoft Office interface where you can choose Alt Text. So here's what that looks like in Office 365. When I right-click the image and choose Edit All Text, it brings up a pane, and then I can enter the description in the text field. So in this case, the alt text that I've selected is faculty photo for that instructor, Michelle Benson Young. Also here, there is a checkbox And the label for that is mark as decorative. So again, if that image were just there for just decoration or just visual appeal or eye candy, as some people say, I could say, I could mark that as decorative, and then that would tell the screen reader, well, that's not that important. It doesn't add to the meaning. Just skip it. Some of you may be on older versions of Office. The process is very similar. You'll right-click the image, or you'll choose the option from the ribbon for alt text, and then you'll choose Format Picture, and that will open up a pane again, and you're going to choose the Size and Position tab. It's the third from the left. It looks like a little square with some arrow, or a blue square with some white arrows inside of it. And then you want to put in your description in the right text field here. There's two. And so this used to be very confusing in Microsoft Office because there was a title field and a description field. And you want to make sure that you put your alternative text in the description field. The reason for that is if you were to transfer this content to another format, like say PDF or EPUB, then that's the text field that's going to be used for the alternative text in the exported format, the exported file. So you want to make sure you're using that description field. Can't emphasize that enough. So again, here the description would be faculty photo for whoever that faculty member is, Michelle Benson Young. And by the way, the steps for doing it in Google Docs, if you're using that to create most of your content, are very similar. You'll right-click the image, choose alt text, and then
We seem to have lost Luis momentarily.
Yeah, his microphone is still on, but I've lost his audio feed as well. Let's hold on just a minute.
I know.
Yeah,
they're having storms. They're having storms down in Florida, so I think he's struggling a bit with internet connection. I know both he and I work from home a certain amount of each year, so I think he's in a home office at the moment. And
Luis's best shot might be to do what he did before, which would be to log out and log back in. We'll message him and hold on, folks. We'll straighten this out.
Yeah, we will. So just looking at these basic guidelines for image description, I think it's no surprise you want to start with the purpose of the image, and the alt text is really, it stands for alternative text, right? So it's if a screen reader comes to this picture, it doesn't know what it is, and it will just say, what it will say to you if you were listening to a screen reader and it came to a series of images and there was no alt text, what you hear is image, 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 image. It's not very pleasant and certainly not very helpful for somebody who's blind.
Right.
So, you want to have Luis was differentiating between important images that provide context or provide knowledge, and decorative things that may be fun or pretty but are really kind of eye candy, right? So you want to understand the purpose of the image, and then second, start with a broad overview, and then a few relevant details. Describe any important relationships that maybe this chart, like a table or a chart, for example. You may want to provide a little bit of, because there's data in that, you may just not want to say chart. You may want to say something like, this chart illustrates the fact that 50% more students are joining clubs on campus than this year than in prior years, or something, right? All right, let's see here.
Maybe we can take that question from Cheryl, who asks, I'm looking at her questions. So is this a description in her case? She says, let me just scan up to her question here, Rachel, for a minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this slide is how to decide what the alt text should say. She's making the comment, you have to know the purpose. I guess that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to understand why there's a picture there, and then you have to provide the information. And it's really nice that I didn't know that there were ways to just sort of have the screen reader skip the image altogether, so that way it knows not to even say image or, you know. Let's see what Luis's next slide is. We may come back to this in a minute.
Sure. Let's just do a double check
Okay.
and see if he's here. Luis, are you on audio? I don't think so. I think he would have come back in. Okay, I'm going to message him. Why
Yeah.
don't you keep going then, Rachel?
Okay. All right. So let's see here. Looks like he has some quality image descriptions, 3 different, I think these are tools or things that can help you make decisions about how to do your image descriptions. And hopefully he'll come back on with us in just a moment and get into the details about these various tools. Let's see if we've got some other questions that I can answer. Let's see, Madeline is telling us, yes, and guidelines on how to write image descriptions. Oh, and sure, thank you, Madeline. I appreciate that. Madeline is with WGBH, and she says the Diagram Center guide goes through many types of images and gives specific guidance. Okay, that's great. Tim is saying all of this seems like a huge challenge for the typical faculty member to know about and respond to. It seems to me that this is an area for specialists. You know, Tim, I agree with you in some ways, but I think, you know, our goal is really to just make folks aware of a certain amount of this. Most community colleges, for sure, have some kind of, you know, accessibility, disability center on campus, and they have some support. But I do think what's nice about becoming more knowledgeable yourself is it means that when you're interacting with those folks on your campus, you're in a position where you can sort of feel like you're asking informed questions. And so our goal certainly is to empower faculty to feel like, while they may not be doing all the work themselves, this gives them more information to go on when they're working with their disability specialists or accessibility specialists on their campus. Oh, okay, so you don't have that on your campus. Well, that and we know that is part of the reason we created the AccessATE project, because we did hear from faculty that for some people they have very little support.
I am back. Can you hear me?
Yay! Yes, we can.
Thank you, Luis.
So,
Luis.
Yeah, another one.
Go ahead, Luis.
Glitches. So I just wanted to mention, you know, that's a lot that I've thrown at you, but I want to share with you a few resources so that, again, you can continue your learning. So WebAIM is a great source for information on accessibility overall, and they have a really nice alternative text tutorial where you can see some examples of different types of images. And so you can see how the context really impacts the description that you're going to create. The W3C also has a great resource. It's the title is an alt decision tree, and it's essentially sort of a flow chart where it asks you a few questions, and as you answer those questions, it kind of helps you narrow down what would be the appropriate description for an image. So it's a great tool for you to practice your description skills, because again, going back to our quote, it's something where the more you do it, the better you get at it. And then finally, if you're, you know, describing a lot of charts, graphs, flow charts, more complex images, the Diagram Center has some great resources, not only in terms of the guidelines for doing complex image description, but lots of examples. And sometimes it's really helpful to look at examples so that you can see how an expert would do it. And then over time, that helps you as well develop those skills. So I think the next slide is, before.
Rachel, I've lost Luis again.
Yep. It seems like we're struggling with weather stuff in Florida a lot. Somebody just asked, if they could get linkable, if they could get links to the slides. I was just typing an answer to you, Cheryl. You'll get the whole set of slides from us, as well as the recording in the next few days. So you'll be able to just go through and be able to easily click on those and get to all of the resources. So it looks like we're going to teaching with accessible video. I'm wondering, so this is another section of our discussion today. Let's just take a look at the next slide here.
Oh, questions.
Okay. Okay, so questions. So, all right, so this is the section. Let me just go back here.
Yeah.
Let's go back to this. So this is another set of resources that Luis just wanted to share with you. I would also encourage you, Madeline, maybe you could type in NCAM's information too, because that's another great set of materials on making media more accessible. NCAM is part of WGBH in Boston, and they have a huge wealth of information about accessible media and accessible video. All right, so let's get into some questions here. We'll see how I do answering them. I'll give it a shot, folks, until we are joined by our content expert again. So somebody in the chat window chatted me and said, can I get direct support from AccessATE or CAST in making materials accessible? Which is a really good question. If you're part of the ATE community, we are going to be working directly with folks from the AT community with 9 or 10 projects or centers to kind of do some before and after where we work with them to make their curriculum and other materials more accessible. And as I mentioned before, those of you who are not involved with ATE, we have a sister project called ATE Central. And if you're interested in learning, whoops, see if I can type that. And AT Central explains a lot more about the AT community and about connects you up with the National Science Foundation. So you can, thanks Ed, that's a much better version of that URL than I typed in. And oh, Holly's asking, for videos, is closed open captioning enough or is a transcript needed as well? And Madeline Rothberg is going to answer that in just a moment, Holly. And Luis can answer it. Yay, he's back.
I'm going to try not to touch my computer too much. But definitely closed captions, as Madeline says, are better. And the reason for that is when you have open captions, they're basically burnt into the video file. So whatever size, whatever font you chose, then that's fixed in the video itself. Whereas if you do closed captions, well, not only is there the flexibility of the person being able to turn them on and off, but also in most of the players, you can go in and you can change the size, you can change the color of the text, you can add drop shadow. So lots more flexibility with the closed captions as opposed to the open captions. And then with regard with the transcript, I would recommend as much as possible to include a transcript. And the reason why, as Linda said, provide both is there are people who are both blind and deaf or deaf-blind. And so the only way that they would be able to access that content is most likely using a Braille display. And so you want to make sure that you provide that transcript for that population as well. And then there are times when maybe you don't have time to consume the video at that time. But if you have, as Linda said, an interactive searchable transcript, well, then you can go through the transcript probably much quicker than being able to watch the video. So hopefully that answers that question.
All right, well, let's keep moving through. There are a few other questions, but we'll save some of those for other question breaks. Luis, I think you can keep
absolutely
going ahead.
All right, so we just addressed the first principle, which is perceivable. The second one is going to be operable. And so the key question that we're trying to answer here is, can everyone navigate the content with ease? Can they tell where they are? Can they tell what to do next? And so the supports that we want to put in place is we want to make sure that we're using styles for our section headers, and we want to make sure that we're creating descriptive hyperlinks. And by the way, in these slides on pour, the image that you see is the tip of a pitcher pouring some water into a wine glass. So I hope that that helps you remember the 4 principles. So what we're trying to do here is pour accessibility into our designs, just like you pour water into a glass. All right, so when it comes to styles, there's 3 benefits to using them. The first one is that they provide, and probably this is the most important one, they provide in-page navigation for screen reader users. So imagine that you have a long document, right? And that the section that you really want to focus on is all the way at the bottom of the screen or at the bottom of the page. Well, visually, you could just scan to that section, right, and start reading from that point. But if you're a screen reader user, well, the way screen readers work is that they read the content from top to bottom, left to right in a very linear way. So you would have to listen to everything at the top of that page until you get to the section that you want. But if you've marked up your section headers correctly, they can serve as landmarks so that a screen reader user can skip around the document. And basically, when they get to the section that they want, and again, we want to make sure that those section headers are descriptive, then they can start reading from that point on. So most screen readers support this kind of keyboard shortcut where you can get a list of all of the headings on the page or on the document, and then you can skip to a specific section. Another benefit of styles is that they ensure consistency, especially if you have long documents that are several hundred pages, because they serve as a style sheet in a way where you can change the style once, and then wherever you've applied that same style, then those changes are going to cascade through the document. So if you make your heading level 1 style a certain size and a certain color, and then you apply that heading level 1 style throughout your document, everywhere that you've marked up text with that style, that change can be reflected at once. And then just thinking about it from more of a universal design for learning perspective, is that you can do things like create a table of contents for a long document. And that's a really nice way for people to navigate, but it also reveals how the information is organized. And that can help with understanding as well. So it goes beyond accessibility to also helping people sort of understand how the information is organized. So here's an example again from a syllabus. In a syllabus, you may have sections, telling the people that enroll in the course information about the textbook. That could be a section. And then there may be a course website where students access the discussion boards and the announcements and so on. And so those could be 2 different sections in the syllabus. And the way that most people create those headers for those sections is that they'll select the text, and then they'll go up to the toolbar and maybe choose a different text size, like say 18 or 20, and then make it bold. Unfortunately, that doesn't add the code in the background or the markup that's necessary to make that section header behave like a section header. It makes it look like a heading, but it doesn't behave like one for users of assistive technology. So the correct way to do it is to apply styles. So you will select the text that you want to make into a section header, and then you'll go up to the ribbon in Microsoft Office, and you'll choose one of the available styles. So for instance, if it's the title of a document, you might choose a heading level 1 that says this is the most important thing in this document. This is the main idea. It's what this document is about. And if it's a section within that document, you might choose a heading level 2. And then for subsections, you might choose a heading level 3. And the process is very similar in Google Docs, except that instead of having a section of the ribbon, you're going to have a pull-down menu that might say normal at first, because that's the default style. But when you open up that pull-down menu, you might see heading level 1, heading level 2, heading level 3. So again, these are best practices that are not specific to one application. It's just how they're implemented that varies across applications. And when we assign those heading styles, we want to make sure that they follow a logical structure. So for instance, in our syllabus, the course may be Advanced Mathematics 101. So that would be a heading level 1. And then within that syllabus, we may have sections such as instructor information, course materials, and major assignments. And each of those would be a heading level 2 because they're sections. They're split the document into chunks of information. And then within those sections, we might have subsections. So for instance, for course materials, we may have subsections for textbook and course website. And then under major assignments, we might have subsections for the major tests that you would be responsible for, information about a final project or a capstone project, and so on. So you can think about it, this is basically an outline for the content, if you will, that you're trying to create. And there's a really nice way to check your work in Microsoft Office. What you can do is go to the View tab of the ribbon and then check the box for navigation pane. And that will open up a pane off to the side. And if you choose one of the options there that's for headings, you can see how your document is structured. So as you do this, what you want to do is you want to look through to make sure that those headings are nested properly, so it makes sense, there's a logical structure, and then also that they're unique, so that there's no repetition, because that makes them less useful as headings when they're accessed like this on a list. And did you have a question, Rachel?
No, I'm just noticing that we are running a little over due to our time glitches. I just want to kind of give you a gentle reminder of time.
And I think we're scheduled for 2:15, 2:30, right?
Yeah, 2:15, I believe. Yep.
So yeah, thanks for that warning there. So very similar to section headers, we want to make sure that our hyperlinks are also descriptive. Just like with headings, screen reader users typically would press the keyboard shortcut, and that will bring up a list of all of the links on the page. And so that way you can choose which link you want to access. The problem is that a lot of times people will use something like click here for the link text, or more, or learn more, so variations of that theme. And so when you see them on the list like this, which is the way a screen reader might present it to someone, if they press the keyboard shortcut for that feature, then it's difficult to determine which one you want to follow. So a better way to do that is to just have some descriptive text and then make that the hyperlink. So for instance, here we would have two different links, and one would say course textbook, the other one would say course website. So that way it's really easy if the links are accessed out of context, meaning that the rest of the page is not available because they're on a list, then it's possible to determine which one you want to follow. Similar to that, another thing that I often see is that people put the raw URL in their documents. And the problem with that is sometimes, especially with some of the Google tools, when you share a document, you get a super long URL with lots of kind of symbols and random numbers in it. And so that can be really difficult to hear read aloud. In fact, I'm going to do a demo of that here on one of my devices. So I'm going to tap speak on my device, and you're going to hear this long URL read aloud.
https://docs.google.com/document/d/1DWL6MTTERTSFNZ4VPROPJ8CHOMFFQ1039SXKSBO.
So as you can hear, that's not very descriptive. It's kind of confusing, especially if you had quite a few of those that you had to listen to in a document. So again, instead what we want to do is select some descriptive text, like in this example, course syllabus, and then make that the link that we would share. And you can include information in parentheses, like for instance, what type of document it is. That can be helpful as well, so that people know what's going to happen when they follow that link. So I'm going to skip this Q&A just since we're running low on time, because the last two are a little bit simpler than these first two of POUR.
I think that makes sense, Luis, and people can email you and I with questions afterwards too, if there's specific things they want to know more about.
Absolutely. So we've looked at perceivable, we looked at operable. Understandable is the third principle of POUR. And basically, we want to make sure that the language is appropriate for our audience. And the best way to do that is to use plain language and to check the readability level of our content. So plain language means avoid jargon, avoid, or if you use abbreviations or acronyms, make sure you expand them the first time that you use them so that people are clear on what you mean. And then there's some ways to check the readability level. In fact, Microsoft Office has a built-in readability checker. You can go to your preferences and under spelling and grammar, you can enable the readability statistics, and they can tell you what reading level your document has. And generally, you're aiming for about a 9th to 10th grade, depending on what the audience is, right? So if it's a more advanced audience, it may be a little bit higher. For the general public, that's what you aim for, 9th to 10th grade. There are also a couple of tools available online that allow you to check the readability level. My favorite one is the Hemingway app. So this allows you to take a chunk of text, you can copy and paste it into the app, and then it tells you what the reading level is, and it gives you some tips for how you can address some of the reading level challenges. Sometimes it means you need to split up some of the long sentences into shorter, more compact, simpler sentences, and so on. And then the other one is the Readability Analyzer. So again, these are online tools where you copy and paste the text, and then they give you a reading level that, and again, 9th to 10th grade is in general what you want to aim for a general audience. That brings us to the last one, which is robust. And basically, what you're aiming for here is making sure that you're following best practices and that your content is as compatible as possible with as many devices as possible. And one way to do that is to perform an accessibility check. And fortunately, in Microsoft Office, there is now an accessibility checker. You'll find that under the ribbon. There's a review tab. If you don't see it in your ribbon, you could also do a search for it. So just type in check accessibility in the Microsoft Office search, and it should help you find that option. The caveat is that, accessibility checkers are not perfect. So there's always a need to do some manual checking to make sure that there are no false positives. And also it's helpful to know some of the best practices that I've shared too, so that you know how to fix some of the issues that come up. But the accessibility checker that's built into Microsoft Office is really nice in that it provides you some tips for how to address the challenges that it discovers. If you're on the Google platform, there is something called Grackle. It's a free add-on. Well, it is freemium add-on. It allows you to do the check, but then you have to pay in order to get the guidance for how to fix things. It used to be free, but recently they changed their model. And so now it does the check for you, but if you want to see how to fix things, then you have to sign up for a paid account. So again, with many of these checkers, it helps to know some of the best practices so that you know what to do when an error is found. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. I want to share the resource where you can learn more. So if there was something that wasn't clear to you, there's a number of ways you can contact me, but also you can access this section of our website, which is Designing for Accessibility with POUR. And you will have information there on a variety of different tools and how to implement these best practices, whether it's Office, Google Docs, and so on. So I think we want to stop with a quick reflection here. I want to know from you, what will be your next steps for creating more accessible materials based on what you learned today? And then we'll also some questions as well.
Sure. The P in POUR stands for, is it perceivable? Is that
That's
right?
correct.
Perceivable. All right.
So perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust.
All right. So why don't we do this, Luis? You've shared some info here, and folks, you're going to get these slides, so you'll have all of this, ways to get in touch with AIM, and we're going to click over to AccessATE. This just tells you a little bit how to get in touch with us too. But we would love for you, before you leave us, to fill out a survey for us about the webinar today. So I'm going to have Mike load the survey, and then we can work through some questions too while folks are filling out the survey. This should open for you, everybody, in a separate window, and if you don't see it, Mike will put the link in the chat box for you too. So let's see if there's some other questions.
I see one that comes up quite a bit, and if you don't mind, I could address it real quick.
Please do. Absolutely. That would be great.
It has to do with a lot of authoring tools. There's a difference, two different styles, a title style and a heading 1, heading 2. And
yeah, people are debating about this in chat, so it's a good thing for you to step in and comment on, Luis.
I'm going to step in.
Yeah, no, do it.
Generally, I use the distinction that I make is this a section of a longer work? So if I have a book, for instance, and it has a cover page, I will use the title and subtitle styles on the cover page. And then for each section of that book or each chapter, I will use the heading level 1 to start that section. So this is not necessarily something in the standards, but it's something that I've seen a lot of people do. It's kind of become best practice over time. So if you have just a one-pager, it might be okay to just start with heading level 1 as your first style that you apply. So let's see what people think about that. I'm just trying to make a case to you. So again,
yeah,
the work has a cover page or an opening section. You might use title and subtitle, and then heading level 1 for the individual chapters or sections, big sections, if you will.
All right. I haven't seen anyone, multiple people. Oh, somebody said that's what I do. Yes.
All right, so I have some people on my side. I like that.
Yeah. There you go. Woohoo. Well, thanks, everybody. I know we had other questions we didn't quite get to, but we're so thrilled you were able to join us today, and we hope that you'll join us for our next webinar, which will be sometime in the late summer, early fall. We'll let all of you know about that. Luis, thank you so much for all your expertise, and I think it was a great webinar today. Thanks, everybody. And you will get a link. You will get a link to all the material, Linda, all the chat material and everything else.
Good, thanks, Rachel and Luis. That officially ends our webinar today. I'll leave the system open for a few more minutes so people can finish completing their surveys, and then I'll put a little announcement in the chat when we shut down the system. So, Rachel and Luis, thank you again. We'll get that recording. It'll be a YouTube link out to everybody in a couple of days. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Bye.